tonight kicks off week 2 of the 17th annual Odyssey Cultural Festival hosted by the Greek Orthodox community of South Australia. And it's great to be back here at the Ikaros Hall amongst good friends and strong supporters of the Greek community. So on that note, I want to say a big thank you to everyone involved here in the Pan-Ikarian Brotherhood. The Pan-Ikarians are one of the most active cultural groups in South Australia and are doing some really good things, particularly around adapting to the ever-changing society and ensuring that their community stays relevant to today. Recently they had a very well-attended AFL Grand Final day, and I know that was a successful event, and that's a huge credit to a very fresh-thinking approach by the committee here and the hard work that comes along with that. So well done to the Ikarians. On the topic of hard work, I just want to quickly point out Hellas Lucas. She looks shocked that I mentioned her name. Hellas is the chair of our cultural committee. I think every organisation needs a person like Hellas, and I don't think she gets the credit that she really deserves. So Hellas, thank you for tonight, and also Eleni came out to her as well. Thank you, Eleni. On that note, I'll just quickly talk about tonight's discussion. We can now call him Dr. Yianni Cartledge. I think it's the first time I've been able to say that, so congratulations, Dr. Cartledge. Tonight's discussion looks at Ikarian immigration from the Aegean region to South Australia between 1900 and 1945, loosely corresponding to the period between Federation and World War II. Our focus will be their settlement and community formation, especially across key locations in South Australia. In South Australia, such as Port Pirie and the Adelaide CBD. The talk is an update of the talk Yianni gave us a couple of years back and presents the outcomes of a larger PhD project aimed at exploring Aegean island migration to the English-speaking world between 1815 and 1945, with the Ikarians of South Australia being just one of the case studies. I'll just quickly mention as well that Yianni's got a couple of books that are for sale. Rob's got them at the back, so if you haven't got a copy yet, please do so at the end of the lecture, or talk. I won't call it a lecture because I think it's going to be pretty interesting. And at the end of the talk as well, I think we've got some refreshments and some more food to come out as well. So, Dr. Cartledge, I'll hand it over to you from here.
All right. One second, please. All right, thanks everyone for coming out tonight. As Peter mentioned, this discussion looks at Ikarian immigration from the Aegean region to South Australia between 1900 and 1945. Really going to be looking at their settlement and the way they form community, especially in key locations in South Australia such as Port Pirie and the Adelaide CBD. This talk is an update of the talk that I gave in 2022 and presents sort of the other end, the outcomes of the project. And I'd just like to acknowledge that I'm giving this presentation from the lands of the Kaurna people, and we respect their spiritual relationship with their country. I would also like to thank everyone at GOCSA, especially Peter and Hellas, for setting up tonight, for their support as well in organising this event, as well as everyone here at the Pan-Ikarian Brotherhood, Uncle George and Socratis. Thanks for everything you've done with all the talks I've done here. And also to my supervisors, Professor Andrakos Varnava, Dr. Evan Smith, for helping me through my research. So my PhD project, which I submitted in December, examined the migration of Greek Aegean islanders to the English-speaking world between 1815 and 1945. I focused on two corresponding case studies, the first being Greeks from the island of Chios, who emigrated to London between 1815 and 1900, although they spread to other parts of Britain, including Liverpool and Manchester. And the second was from Greeks from the island of Ikaria, who settled in South Australia between 1900 and 1945. Most notably in Adelaide and Port Pirie, but also in the towns of the SA and West Coast. I looked at their reasons for emigration, their methods of settlement, and the way they built communities, both short and long term, and ultimately integration into their respective places of settlement, as well as the way they navigated their own identities. The project was conducted using archival research, especially through censuses, shipping records, migration papers, newspapers, photographs, and these have all been sourced from Australian archives, but I did use GOCSA's archives and the archives here at the Ikaros Hall as well as part of the project. So the research aimed really to continue the research of past and current historians of the Ikarian diaspora. These include the works of Michael Tsounis, Eleni Apostolaki Ikaros, Stylianos Simakis, who published a book in 2015, as well as people that look at the American case studies listed here, among others as well. And these sort of, I guess, set the groundwork for my project, which went into that earlier period in more depth, in a sense. So firstly, I'll briefly contextualize Ikaria. As most of us know, it's located in the North Aegean Sea, close to the larger islands of Samos and Chios, and the smaller islands of Patmos and Furni. It's also very close to the Turkish coast, particularly to Izmir and Kuşadası. Ikaria was a part of the Ottoman Empire until 1912, when the Ikarian Revolution took place, and for 6 months the island was independent with its own president before joining Greece at the end of 1912. And you can see the Ikarian flag in the hall inside on the wall. As this anecdote suggests, Ikaria had a long history of autonomy in varying forms, but the island was actually officially autonomous from the 1830s, when there were special privileges granted under Sultan Mahmud II, and this has created a unique independent identity to form on the island, and this carried throughout the diaspora. And you can see here from the Ikarian revolutionary period, stamps from the Free State of Ikaria. You can actually still purchase them on eBay. And a snippet from the Kalgoorlie miner talking about the Ikarian Revolution. And this is how it's kind of publicised even as far as Kalgoorlie at the time. So as part of this project, I kind of put together my own timeline of Ikaria's recent migration history. And I know it's probably a bit tricky to see, but really there are sort of links these key events in Ikarian history to the emigrations, which are kind of situated between them. I've also placed the key moments in policy as well alongside this, because the policy did navigate how Ikarians migrated, when they migrated, and where they migrated to. I think some notable events that should be mentioned is that in 1898, the Ikarian Brotherhood of Egypt formed, and this was the very first Ikarian Brotherhood documented anywhere. In 1897, or 1901, between then, the first Ikarians arrived in Australia, but they were to the eastern states. From 1903, the Pan-Ikarian Brotherhood of America formed, another very early organisation. And in 1910, we get the first Ikarians in Port Pirie in South Australia. Then we have 1912 with Ikaria becoming independent and joining Greece, followed by the turmoil of the Balkan Wars and World War I. And following this, we had in 1920 an influx of Ikarians to South Australia. And among these were also key events in community formation in Australia, including the Greek Orthodox community of Port Pirie in 1924. We just celebrated their 100-year anniversary, and the Greek Orthodox community of SA in 1930, who have an upcoming 100-year anniversary. So really that timeline illustrates that there was an increasing pace of Ikarian migration from the first half of the 20th century onwards. So Ikaria was a relatively isolated place for much of its history, with few people coming or going. However, the earliest recorded Ikarian migrations were to other places in the Ottoman and Aegean world. This included movements of Ikarians during the 19th century to places like Chios, Syros, Izmir, Istanbul, Athens, and Egypt. The growth of Ikarian migrant communities in Izmir was significant. In 1800, Izmir was a very multicultural place. Only 20% of its population actually spoke Greek in 1800, but by 1900 the Greek speakers were the majority in the city, and most new migrants actually came from the nearby Aegean islands. Ikarians were no exception to this, and you can see here many Ikarians in Izmir around the year 1900. The first major frontier for Ikarian migrants was simultaneously to the US and Egypt during the late 19th and early 20th century, and this was driven by one element driven by the Suez Canal's booming economy. Egypt really became the most popular destination for Ikarians. It is noted that many Ikarians, as well as Chiotes and other Aegean island labourers, were actually employed to dig the Suez Canal. The 1869 opening of the Suez Canal actually coincided with a phylloxera plague, which attacks wine and grapevines in the Aegean, and other economic turmoil that caused. And this caused many islanders to seek larger urban centres, such as Cairo and Alexandria, to kind of as a safe haven for economic reasons. So the booming Ikarian charcoal and tobacco industries also caused many Ikarians to start selling their products abroad, with Egyptian buyers being some of the biggest clients. So by 1898, the first Ikarian Brotherhood had formed, and that was in Alexandria. 5 years later, the second formed in Cairo, which you can see here, and the Ikarian community of Egypt numbered upwards of 500 members. And many of these members would actually end up in Australia later on. Similarly, the US was also receiving migrants during this time, with over 3,000 Ikarians leaving for the US between 1899 and 1924, and a community and a brotherhood formed around Pittsburgh in 1903, and these movements set the stage for the next frontier, which was Australia. Before discussing their arrival in Australia, though, I do want to discuss the reasons that they were leaving Ikaria during the early 1900s. The early 20th century saw Ikaria touched by the Young Turk Revolution of 1908, as well as the Balkan Wars from 1912 and 1913. For the Aegean Islands, this revolution promised a maintenance and even increase in the privileges they received in the previous century. However, when citizenship and voting rights for Christians came under question in 1909, a slow tightening of privileges began that saw further tensions build between Orthodox and Muslim Ottomans. So this tightening also included a crackdown on Ikarias and other Aegean islanders' unlicensed tobacco industries, which curbed production and raised taxes on the product. And this period can really be described as a loss of autonomy for the Ikarians. In addition to the tobacco restrictions, Ikarian vineyards were again ruined through an epidemic of phylloxera around 1910. So during the 1910s, there was an outbreak as well of the bubonic plague on the neighbouring island of Chios, which was one of the region's largest economic centres and a large trading partner with Ikaria. Chios' quarantining also stifled the Ikarian economy. So these social and economic tensions certainly attributed to Aegean Islander migration, which became most pronounced during this period, as well as influenced revolutionary ideas on Ikaria, which also culminated in the 1912 revolution. So the first Ikarians to arrive in Australia, as I mentioned, arrived in the eastern states. The possible first being a man named Christopher Frangos, who settled in Melbourne and then Western Australia, and the second being two men, George Camden and Stamatios Lofu, who arrived in Sydney. However, not much is documented about them, even the correct spellings of their names, and I've tried to piece together the stories of Frangos, Camden and Lofu. So Frangos arrived at Port Melbourne aboard the Weimar German mail boat in July 1897. He had arrived in Australia from Egypt and had listed his birthplace, at the time he had listed his birthplace as Samos, Turkey, although later documents he listed it as Ikaria. Many Ikarians and Fudnians did this at the time. They would list Samos as their place of birth. In Melbourne, Frangos became a fruiterer and eventually moved to Perth and then to Dawn, Western Australia, where he also worked in gold mines. So in the pre-1940s period, there were many examples of naturalisation records following this pattern. And seen here, you can see examples of Ikarians being listed as from Samos, so Nea, the village of Nea in the state of Samos, Evdilos in the state of Samos, or Furni, Samos. Often when looking for Ikarians, Samos is the key thing to look for, due to having been the administrative centre for most of Ikaria's history. So for the case of Christopher Frangos, we can only assume that he followed this same pattern and listed his birthplace as Samos initially before adopting his Ikarian birthplace later on. So the other two men, who are known as Lofu and Camden, arrived in Sydney aboard the Ras Elba on the 6th of November 1901. These are the earliest verified Ikarians in Australia. Interestingly, the men who are aged 18 and 20 listed their nation as Ikaria, rather than Turkey or Greece at the time, and this attests to the independent Ikarian identity that had been cultivated over the 19th century. Lofu and Camden represented a common theme of Ikarian and other Mediterranean migrants' mobility, where young single men travelled together, seeking employment. However, Lofu and Camden, how long they actually stayed in Australia, and whether or not they settled in Sydney or elsewhere is unclear, as their names were never actually recorded again, and they don't really resemble any other Ikarian names clearly. However, when looking at this, I think Lofu could have been a misspelling of another Ikarian surname. Lefas might be one example, and there was a man by the same name who went to America just after going to Australia, called Stamati Lefas instead of Stamati Lofu, and you can trace his story in the US. This was not uncommon for Ikarian migrants to jump between Australia and America back and forth. You could also read Lofu as Sapos, that might be another example of who this man could have been. George Camden is actually a little bit trickier to trace because there's no other records of anyone with a similar name. However, it could be an anglicised version of an Ikarian surname, maybe Candias. However, I haven't found any further records on this man. What can be concluded, however, is that there was an Ikarian presence in Australia from as early as 1901. So on arrival, early Ikarians, like the men mentioned, had to navigate strict procedures of the newly federated nation. Before Federation, Australia followed colonial laws that focused on barring mainly Chinese immigrants from entering the country. This anti-non-European immigration attitude was coupled with internal and systemic racial ideologies towards Indigenous Australians, heavily influenced by the era's eugenic approach to population. This ideology was so persistent in Australian political circles that the Commonwealth even sent former South Australian Premier Sir John Cockburn as its representative to the First International Eugenics Conference in 1912. So this period's racial ideology was strongest seen in the White Australia policy, which was the initial part of the immigration, which initial part was the Immigration Restriction Act. And this was the first major legislation passed in the newly federated Commonwealth. So the Act favoured immigration of European descent, holding shipmasters financially responsible for non-Europeans disembarking in Australia. Good migrant behaviour was also a feature of the Act, and European migrants with good references, especially from their ship's captain, had better chances at migrating successfully. This Act also saw the dictation test for new arrivals introduced, which cultivated a bias against non-British or non-English speaking migrants that lasted until 1958. Migrants who did not fit their immigration officer's criteria were subject to the English test, which, if they passed, could then be given in a second European language, such as German, Dutch, French, or even Gaelic. So failure to pass the second test would then send the migrant back to their port of origin. So really manipulation of the dictation test became a means of selective migration, which created a legal procedure that allowed officials to deport unwanted migrants with ease. Many early Greek migrants were even questioned of their skin colour in this period, especially those born in the Ottoman Empire or Turkey, which the Ikarians fit within in the early days. And some excerpts from nationalisation papers are seen here, and these are all questioning of whether these people were, whether he was a coloured man or looking for their racial origin. Like elsewhere, ship jumping, characterised as the act of desertion or being a stowaway, was a common feature of early migrants to Australia. Migrants saw desertion as an easier avenue into Australia compared to the difficulties and prejudices of the Commonwealth's immigration policies. And this was also a way around strict immigration quotas, especially for non-British migrants who, although they weren't given a number like the US, were capped at being a maximum of 2% of Australia's population. And many Ikarian families at the time did follow this ship jumping story as part of their migration. So on that note, the question is, why did Ikarians and other Greek islanders then choose South Australia as their place of settlement? So after the three men we discussed, the next Ikarians to come to Australia pretty much all headed to South Australia. There were many factors drawing Ikarians to SA in this period. One of the most significant was the opening of the BHP smelters in Port Pirie in 1889. After opening, the smelters began drawing multitudes of working class male migrants who saw the smelters as an opportunity for steady, lucrative work. Other factors included a policy change after Federation, fueled by the White Australia policy and the Pacific Islanders Labourers Act. This saw thousands of Pacific Islanders forced to leave Australia by 1908, which left a gap in the early Australian workforce for labouring males. Many scholars have viewed Southern Europeans as 20th century replacements for Pacific Islanders and others that weren't allowed to enter Australia. At the other end of the Anglosphere, the United States had very limited quotas on Greek migrants during this period. At one point, there was only 100 Greeks per year in the whole nation of the US, which enabled and pushed more islanders to Australia than to the US. This period also saw the beginnings of chain migration for many of these Aegean islanders in particular, young labouring males who were arriving in pairs or groups, followed by their relatives or Yianni, fellow villagers. The opening of the Suez Canal also boosted movement between the Mediterranean and the Indian and Pacific Oceans, which included Australia. So in all, as historian Eric Richards has discussed, mass migrations, in a sense, for people like the Ikarians, stem from a sense of migrants wanting more or seeking opportunity. And this also appears to have been a huge driving factor in this period, as South Australia of the 1910s and 20s was seen as offering more to the Ikarians. So recently there's been a study by Stylianos which explored the extent of Ikarian migration worldwide. It is a very good study, however he only notes that 3 Ikarians came to Australia between 1911 and 1920. So after seeing the photos in the previous slides, more than 18 Ikarians that have been identified in these photos, as well as other anecdotal evidence from earlier research, I knew Simakis' assessment was incorrect, and since then, via the archival record, I've been able to identify a significant community of Ikarians that arrived, worked, lived, and even died in Australia, and specifically in South Australia in the 1910s. Really, although this is a significant group, these numbers are small in comparison to larger communities at the time, from Ithaca, Kithera, and Castellorizo. However, they constitute a very firm foundation for the larger Ikarian migration of the 1920s onwards. So, as you can hopefully see here, by 1921 there were at least 60 Ikarians in Australia, including 4 already Australian-born of Ikarian descent. And by 1945 there were at least 257 Ikarians, with 195 of those being in South Australia. So Port Pirie had the largest concentration, with 68 Ikarians residents at different points between 1910 and 1945. The very first confirmed Ikarian arrivals to SA happened in 1910 and 1911. And I say confirmed as we mentioned there were many undocumented arrivals in addition to the numbers I'm giving you here. John Barsamis, who's at the top of this table, who settled in Port Pirie, was the very first among arriving in 1910. He was followed by multiple in 1911 arrivals. Many of these men arrived together, including my ancestor, John Gronthos, his brother, Kostas Gronthos, their brother-in-law, Christos Safos, and nephew, Kostas Safos, as well as Theodore Evaliotis, Antonios Lukadakis, G. Mustalas, and Stamatis Stamoulis. Lukadakis, out of all these men, was the only one that, they did leave SA at different times, but he actually went and settled in WA. Stamoulis, I believe, settled in New South Wales later on. So, interestingly, it should be noted that in Port Pirie in 1919, there were also two men from Nea, Ikaria, who died of Spanish flu, Demetrius Space and John Hatzinakis. Record of their arrivals hasn't been found yet, but they did die in Port Pirie in 1919. So this was recorded in the Port Pirie Reporter newspaper that year. Interestingly, the 1916 secret census confirms the significant Ikarian settlement in this period. While the standard censuses for this period were 1901, 1911 and 1921, there was also a secret census conducted in 1916, and the secret census catalogued all Greeks in Australia and was conducted by local police on behalf of Australian Special Intelligence. It took the names, addresses, genders, ages, occupations, families, and means of communication and transport of all the Greeks in the state, but also in the nation. And it sought to keep Greek cafes and meeting places under observation as well. The secret census was portrayed as a precaution against Greece joining the Central Powers during World War I, with the intent to intern Greek migrants. However, the era's anti-immigrant sentiment may have also played a significant role in fueling the decision to conduct the census. And I think historian Hugh Gilchrist notes that out of all the Greeks counted in Australia, only 7 nationwide were found to be actually disloyal to the Allies during the secret census. So the secret census itself actually lists 24 Ikarians in Australia in 1916, with 20 of those in South Australia and 19 of those in Port Pirie. Most lived together in joint homes, such as the 8 men who lived at Geddes Lane together. 5 also were together at 2nd Street. They were virtually all labourers and employed by the smelter, and were between the ages of 18 and 40. Only one of the South Australian men broke this mould, and this was a man called John Mazaris of Mill Street, who became a watchmaker. Victoria and Queensland both had only one Ikarian each at this point, and 2 were in Western Australia. So the large migration during the 1910s and 20s ultimately led to the formation of the Greek community of Port Pirie in 1924, which we mentioned celebrating their centenary this year. This was the earliest instance of formal community organisation among the Greeks of SA, and Australia's 2nd or 3rd, as we've chatted, oldest community. Throughout this period, Greek Islander settlement in South Australia thrived on what can be called the Port Pirie system. So on arriving in Port Pirie, Ikarians and other islanders instantly joined a network of their compatriots who assisted in providing housing, finding employment, which was usually within the smelter, and making sure their fellow islanders had the means of survival. The Greek Orthodox community and church on Florence Street was central to this system, as were the many nearby Florence Street Greek cafes. It was also the first stop for many Greeks who would eventually move on to the other growing centres around the state, including Port Lincoln and the Riverland, as well as across the borders to Mildura, Broken Hill, Kalgoorlie, and also to the west coast eventually as well, and then ultimately to Adelaide later on. Many Ikarians made up key components of the Greek community in Port Pirie. Seen here is the Pantheon Club, owned by the Vassamas family of Ikarian descent, which was an important meeting place for the Greek community, and it was also monitored in the secret census in 1916. And in this picture, the Pantheon Club is being used as a shelter during the 1934 Port Pirie floods. And you can notice people on the balcony, as well as the sign saying John Barsamis, Pantheon Coffee Palace, and Pantheon Club signs. And as mentioned, John Barsamis himself was the first recorded Ikarian in South Australia. Other cafes and clubs in Port Pirie became centres of community, and many were monitored in the secret census. As one in particular was the Oceanic Cafe, which was owned by a man called Michael Frangos of Hios, who would later have links with the Adelaide community as well. The 1910s really was shrouded by the Great War. While no Ikarians actually directly participated in World War I in the Australian forces, there was support from the wider Greek community for the war. So in 1917, it was noted that Greeks, along with Italians and Japanese, who took part in charitable Australia Day celebrations at Port Pirie, and they were particularly interesting, and apparently they'd raised over £1,000, which was forwarded to the Soldiers' Fund as a result of their effort. Some Ikarians also used World War I later on as a connection or an appeal on their naturalisation papers. One Ikarian man, Merchant Navy Master Thrasivolos Napoleon Space, was born in 1898, and he emphasised when he naturalised in 1929 that he had served in the Greek Navy with Allied forces at Mudros and Gallipoli as a signaller. Space was residing at Florence Street at the time and working at the BHP smelters, and had arrived in South Australia in 1924 aboard the SS Principessa Giovanna via Egypt with other Ikarian men, including Vasily Lakios and Yakavos Skizas. Another Ikarian, Constantine Alexander Fakaris, who arrived in Port Adelaide in 1926, noted on his 1939 naturalisation request that he had fought with the British Army at Salonika and was wounded, being shot through his left thigh. Ikarians did join the English-speaking Allied forces though, so they didn't join the Australian forces, but they did join other English-speaking Allied forces in World War I, and at least 30 names were recorded as serving in the British Merchant Navy in 1915. These names included members of many recognisable families, including Frangos, Space, Sarnas, Galamboyas, Katsaros, Mavrophilippos, Kapamichalis, Pyrovolikos, and the Petsakos families, among others. I've been able to verify all of these men being born in Ikaria, except for one, although some of the surnames I'm still unable to make clear matches with. So Greek support for the Allies continued throughout the decade, especially from those in the Venizelos camp, which was most Greeks in Australia. And here you can see members of the Port Pirie Greek community celebrating the end of World War I in 1918, and thank you for that, sharing that photo with me. And I think this is just as testifies to not only the size of the community in Port Pirie, but also their support for the Allies during World War I. So back to South Australia, and by 1929, Adelaide began seeing its first influx of Greek migrants to date, its largest influx, sorry. This happened simultaneously to the decline of smelting work in Port Pirie. This coincided with the Great Depression, as well as developments at the smelters, which pushed migrants to seek new work in the larger, more urban economic centres, in this case Adelaide. These developments included the sale of the smelters to the North Broken Hill South and Zinc Corporation in 1926. There was also a BHP mine closure between 1927 and 1929, and the increasing question of poor working conditions and unfair pay for workers. This was reflected by a Royal Commission into lead poisoning in 1925, which sadly shifted some of the blame onto the migrants. There was also a BHP workers' strike in Port Pirie in 1926. So this shift saw Adelaide's Greek population become on par with Port Pirie's and other rural provincial centres, and many islanders began working between Pirie, Adelaide and other towns, including the SA West Coast and then the Riverland. The move to Adelaide also sparked more centralised community organisations. Just prior to this, in 1926, British Secretary of Foreign Affairs Sir Austin Chamberlain received dispatch from Greek diplomat Dimitrios Daklamanos, stating that in view of the numerous Greek colony in South Australia, the Greek government are considering the creation of an honorary consulate in Adelaide, and the Greek consular service was then established in 1926 at 19 Rundle Street, Adelaide, creating a tangible link between the Greek diaspora of South Australia and Greece. George Nikolaidis was appointed the first honorary consul, but he was an active member of the early Greek community. Nikolaidis eventually, though, by 1931 had been replaced as consul by Barossa region winemaker Oscar Benicefeld, who held the role until 1958. So an even more important early feature of the community in Adelaide was the use of Greek cafes, or kafenia, as centres of settlement and community building. This was not a unique phenomenon to Ikarians, and it was also practiced by Adelaide's other pre-World War II Greeks and Cypriots, who centred themselves on, for instance, the Greek kafenio at 122 Unley Street, known as the Hellas Club. But there are other kafenia-based community centres located, especially along Unley Street, including the Cypriot Club at 129 Unley Street, and others, including there was a Rhodes Club that were there. There were also numerous Greek-owned cafes and eateries around Adelaide during the pre-World War II period, dating to as early as 1901. Ikarians and their Port Pirie connections contributed to this growing kafenio culture. The Chioti Michael Frangos of Port Pirie owned both the Alhambra Cafe on King William Street, but also the Oceanic Cafe at Ellen Street, Port Pirie, from 1915. And Woodville residents Nicholas and Gladys Parianos, the Eva of Ikaria or Samos, were founding members of the Athens Cafe at Fort Peel Street, Adelaide. There was also an Ikarian, Constantine Alexander Socratis, who had a kafenio and lodging house, and this was at 137 Unley Street, and this was between the 1930s and 1960s. So the largest early community building effort, however, was the founding of the Greek Orthodox community of SA in 1930. This was actually founded at the Ellis Club at 122 Unley Street, and almost all of the founding members were from the islands. The Castelloris made up the majority, however there were a few Ikarians involved, including members of the Karapidas, Mousselas, Kozamanis and Lesses families. By 1938, with the help of the newly founded Greek Women's Society, GOCSA built the first centralised Greek community church, the original church of Archangels Michael and Gabriel Taxiakis on Franklin Street. It was since rebuilt in the 1960s as a cathedral, and the structural engineer was none other than Ikarian Gronthos. GOCSA's establishment in 1930 demonstrated a shift away from the established Port Pirie system, and it appears that migrants moving away from Port Pirie and the smelters reflected a consciousness shift in the community, which focused on stability of living environment, quality of work and working conditions, and the ability to envision prospects and opportunities, especially for possible future generations. It was at this time as well that there was a demographic change in the Ikarian community. More and more families began arriving and integrating during the 1920s and 30s. This was opposed to the single males of the 1910s and early 20s, who often left their families in Ikaria with the idea of returning wealthy. So the increase of Ikarian and other Greek family units ultimately drove the formation of organisations and the establishment of churches, which also reflected a sense of desire of living in SA permanently, building a long-term community. Specifically, Ikarian community building, separate from the wider Greek community, isn't clear to identify in this period. However, some elements can be seen through chain migration, sponsorships and living within close proximity to each other. Sponsorship was the most common method of settlement and community creation, and from 1924 onwards there was a £40 guarantee which required residents to sponsor a migrant's entry. The majority of earlier Ikarians were sponsored directly by friends or relatives living here in SA. For example, one man, John Karapidas of Port Pirie, he was also the first president of the Pan-Ikarian Brotherhood, sponsored the migration of multiple members of many families, including Karapidas, Frangos, Gronthos, as Kalamboyas families, and even other relatives not from Ikaria, such as the Hatzigeorgiou family. And just a short list of who is sponsored, the families he sponsored can be seen here. This sponsorship system remained a common practice into the post-World War II period. On a final note, a method of integration exhibited by migrants was participation in the Australian war effort. During World War II, around 15 Ikarian Australians served in the Australian Armed Forces. There may also be more to this number, however, so far this is what we have to locate. Members of Xanas, Kotsonithis, Glaros, Sunis, Grikoris, Kondupis, Duris, Karapitis, Pandaladis, Kaneris, Sanzes, Lukadakis and Siros families were represented in this number, so it's quite a diverse range of families that had members serve. The table here lists their age, the date they enlisted and their rank. Interestingly, most of these men lived in SA, but most chose to enlist in different states. And given their labouring backgrounds, most served in employment companies as labourers during World War II. All of them were privates, except for George Sarnas, who was a gunner in an anti-aircraft regiment. Of them, only 5 ended up overseas. George Sarnas went to New Guinea, Borneo, and the Netherlands East Indies. Christos Spiros was in New Guinea. Jack Lucas, or Dukadakis, served in the Middle East, New Guinea, Morotai, and Tarakan in Indonesia. Arthur Tsiros served in New Guinea, New Britain, Ambon, and Borneo. And Robert McLaughlin, who's of unclear origins, served in Japan. Robert's included on this list because he was the son of Eunice Pantelidis, but it is not clear whether Eunice was a Pantelidis by birth or marriage. Someone here might be able to help me with that. 3 of the men also served together in the same regiment. So Nicholas Kotsonithis, John Caneris, and Manuel Pantelidis all served in the 2nd Employment Company. So ultimately, the story of the Ikarians is not a unique phenomenon, as many other migrants have behaved in similar ways. It is also not a new story for most people here, although hopefully I've contributed some new aspects, ideas and interpretations to this unrecorded history. It does, however, speak to the unique sense of identity that the Ikarians had and still have, which has driven their migration and formation of communities. Overall, I've found that the Ikarians really are a perfect example of the trends and methods of migration during the early years of Federated Australia. And when compared to other groups, they exhibit key elements of immigration, settlement, community building, and social integration, while also maintaining their unique identity. The next logical step for the Ikarians was to form their own brotherhood, and which they did after the war in 1958. And we sit there today. So yeah, thank you everyone for coming and listening today, and I hope this has been interesting.
Is there any questions for Sid? Do you want to take the mic around? What do you think?
How difficult do the different spellings that particularly Australian officials would use on different documents with the same person? How difficult does that make your research? And what do you do to overcome it? Because I just know my family name spelled in different ways and different documents.
That was probably one of the biggest challenges. You have to run a search about 20 times with every possible spelling you can think of, even letters that look similar to each other but might make different sounds. Sometimes F was switched with L, or S was switched with L, and you had all sorts of weird mix-ups. It did make it a big challenge. I did get kind of used to it, but I think this is a challenge for most people looking at, especially Greek-speaking migrants in the English-speaking world, because we're translating from a Greek alphabet to an English alphabet with no clear distinction. I found, some families, probably like yours, would have 10, 15 spellings, even on official documents. They'd be spelled different in different places. Even simple names, you would think how many times you can spell Pappas. There's 10 different spellings that were used for different. But yeah, it made it very challenging, but it's also very satisfying when you do crack the code. There's some family names that I only just now been able to find with different spellings I didn't really think of at the time as well. But yeah, I think this is the reason why a lot of their stories are incomplete for a lot of these early migrants, because they're sort of just lost in the record. And even as an example, the Ikarians serving in the British Merchant Navy, one man, Andoni, they spelt his last name Fosk, F-O-S-K, which doesn't resemble any kind of Greek surname you could even think of. So you had these, even though he was born in Ikaria and his first name is clearly Greek, you can't really trace him beyond there because there's just no link you can make. But yeah, that is one of the biggest challenges. So yeah.
They didn't also have problems with the surname. They had problems with the Christian names. For instance, when I started school here, they couldn't say Pan-Ikarian. So I said, what's that? So that's called me Peter.
It just adds another element of struggle to the finding people, really. And yeah, I guess it's one of the battles, but you do kind of find your groove in what actually works when you're searching for names. So, and if anyone's doing family histories on their families, I could probably give you a couple tips on how to search for certain surnames, I guess.
With the list of the early migrants, what ship did they come on? The ones from 1911? Yeah, the early migrants.
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that these four men, the two Gronthoses and the two Sophoses, all came on the same ship, which I sort of lost my mind, my train of thought which ship it was. But it was an Italian ship, I believe, as well, that leaving from the Suez Canal. There was no kind of common ship that they all came on, like which kind of happened later with migrants, where there was these certain ships that were filled with migrants and were doing return journeys. They were all on very random ships. One of the even earlier examples, he came on a German mail boat. So it wasn't even a migrant ship by any means, it was a delivery ship really. So most of these probably were cargo ships in the early days as well. These four men came on the Rune, a ship called the Rune. So it actually was, I think, a British ship, not an Italian ship. But essentially they all virtually got on the ships at Port Said in Egypt and got off at different points in Australia. That was the essential method. But yeah, that wasn't sort of like later on, so we talk about the Amazonia and then Corsica with Cypriots, that they had these certain ships full of migrants. They were sort of scattered amongst kind of cargo and a few British migrants and a few other people, so there was no real proper system in place yet, I guess.
Just, if you don't mind if I ask another question, maybe go to someone else. No. Oh, okay. I noticed a lot of the surnames have the Akis on the end, and my understanding is there's actually Greek heritage, so is it possible that a lot of the Ikarians came from Crete, going back another generation or two generations?
Certainly, yeah. Many Ikarian families have Cretan origins. Seemed to be in the early 1800s, there was a bit of a movement from Crete to Ikaria. There's a lot of families that pop up in Ikaria with Cretan surnames and Cretan ancestors. A lot of people's family here probably have Cretan descent. I know our family does. So yeah, there is a huge movement from Crete to Ikaria, but also from Chios to Ikaria as well. That seems to be the other kind of inward migration to the island itself. So yeah, so a lot of Ikarians have that Chioti component as well. But there wasn't actually, comparative to other islands, there wasn't a huge amount of movement, but there was still enough that it left its mark, I guess.
This is really, really interesting research, and the numbers I scrolled through. What on earth was the attraction of Australia to this few Greek folk? I mean, we know that, for instance, in America it was well known among the villagers, there's wealth and so on, cultural or otherwise. What was the attraction of Australia?
Thanks, Dimitri. That's a very good question. So America had very strict immigration policies compared to Australia at the time. So that sort of pushed a lot of Ikarians to decide, well, and other Greeks as well, that Australia was the next sort of logical place to go. It was sort of a boom, slight boom during this period in Australia, smelting, but other industries, agriculture, fishing. A lot of the great fishing families of SA come from this early migration. Angelakis family, for instance, did some research on, they migrated during this time from Sydney. Really, it was economic reasons that caused Australia to be attractive. At the same time, it was also that chain migration, so their relatives, their friends, were going to the same place. So essentially, these early kind of migrants kicked off that chain of Ikarian migration, and it really continued past the 50s, really. So it was a sort of an unbroken chain of going to the same place. So.
If I could just add to that, it wasn't much past the 1880s when Melbourne was one of the richest cities in the world, based on the gold boom, and then our Copper Triangle was incredibly wealthy. So, you know, in the Facebook at the time, Australia was top property.
And I think around the Federation we were ranked the richest country in the world, I believe, at that point. Yeah.
Just add to that, Tommy, most of these early single men received, there was no industries on these islands, okay? So they were native people, they were on the boats. And Melbourne, Sydney, Darwin and Port Pirie were well-known ports throughout the world. And so, and they knew there was work there, so that's what a lot of them jumped ship in Port Pirie as well.
100%, and yeah, really virtually all of them, as Nick said, yeah, were seamen. It's not many that have come from being a kind of non-maritime background of any kind. Yeah, especially as they were coming through the Suez, jumping on and off ships in Egypt as well. Alright guys, thank you for having me. I really appreciate this, everyone.
This is just for you. I wanted to say thank you for your keen interest in history and ensuring that you do what you can to preserve our history. It's important. It strengthens our understanding of culture, identity, and who we are. So your work is very important. So thank you. Last night, as I said, cultural, the Hellenic Cultural Odyssey Festival. A few events happening this week. I think tomorrow night we've got Local Mothers with the others at Pan-Ikarian Hall in Croydon. $10 if you want to come along and learn how to make Local Mothers. The Limitless events unfortunately sold out, so don't worry about that one. Saturday night we've got a Gypsy here, the musicals journey of the 60s and 70s at Olympic Hall. And I guess the close, obviously we've got the Greek Film Festival as well, so everyone should be able to book it on their chairs tonight. That kicks off next Tuesday night at Huddersfield and Prospect. So please support the Greek community. It's a really good festival. The Greek Film Festival is a highlight as well. So please do what you can, support the events and come out. Thanks again for coming tonight.